I'm very glad to have our next presenter here. His name is Dartil Xavier da Silveira. He is a very renowned medical professional in Brazil. He has been on the front line of public debates, being attacked by the anti-drug medical doctors mafia associations. He frequently goes to public talks, interviews with the media, TV shows. He's the guy everybody talks when they want to have some sort of more progressive view. There's not a lot of folks like him there, so we are very appreciative of his work. I'm also personally very thankful because he's also a teacher to me. I have been a student in his course when I was much younger and I guess much less mature, and I don't know what sort of impression that made, but I think that not so bad because he's here today, so I'm very happy. This conference allows us lots of this ritual inversions where we have all these big masters to us. There, you can, as you know, eat with your bibliography. You can have a coffee with your references. So it's a really great opportunity of exchange. And I think that has a high value for all of us. So I'm not going to give more details on his formal training. He can tell you about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bia. Thank you very much, everyone, being here. I was invited to the MAPS. This is the first time I came to MAPS. And as I was invited the first time, I said I couldn't come. And in the last minute, Bia really insisted a lot, many times. And to the last moment, I accepted this invitation. So I'm here thanks to Bia's insistence. At first, I told Bia that although I have 3 projects, research projects on ayahuasca ongoing, I don't have the results yet. But talking to Bia, I was talking about some things I've been thinking about the adolescence study we have made about some years ago. And Bia thought that it could be a good idea to share these ideas, these reflections, particularly the methodological reflections about research on ayahuasca. In this meantime, in the last weeks, there has been some rumors, some what we call in Brazil small talk, that I was coming here to deny the results of the adolescent studies, what we have done some years ago. That's not the case at all. We have conducted the study. It was a very careful study. A research group, very serious, very cautious. All details were quite good planned. This study resulted in 4 papers published in Journal of Psychoactive Drugs here in California. And I do say that I'm not changing any of my opinions about what has been published. I'm just thinking about what should be done in the future in terms of research. And this study gave me some ideas, some questionings. And that's why I'm here presenting it to you. Oh. Well, this project was conducted, I don't know, everybody knows me. I am a physician, I am a psychiatrist. I've been working with drug addiction for the last 25 years in Brazil, São Paulo, in the School of Medicine of the Federal University in São Paulo. And we have this research in collaboration with the University of California. Many research took part in this research. Charles Grob, who is here, me, Henrique Lopes, neuropsychologist, Evelyn During, who is here, and our neuropsychologist too, Kyle Boone, Luis Alonso, and Marlene de Rios, who died recently, unfortunately. Well, I'm not talking about what ayahuasca is in the end of the presentation. I'll jump this part. I just would like to mention that in the 90s there has been the first important studies on pharmacokinetics, neuroendocrinology, psychiatry, and general health assessment among ayahuasca users. It was called the Ayahuasca Project, conducted by Charles Grob and collaborators. Callaway participated, some publications, McKenna too, related to this first assessment. The rationale for what has been done. It is said about substance use in general that substance use, or particularly misuse, is often associated with psychiatric symptoms. And also that substance use or misuse is often associated with the use of multiple drugs. So the question is, could in some way ayahuasca be related to these problems too? That was the first question. Psychiatric symptoms and the use of multiple drugs. And also that substance misuse is often associated with cognitive impairment. And we know that substance dependence frequently present impaired neuropsychological performance. And on the other hand, subjects presenting a neuropsychological disorder are more prone to abuse drugs. The case of ADD, for instance. These are some rationale to support what we are questioning in the study. We know that neuropsychological impairment is often observed in the person under the effect of hallucinogens, during the effect, the acute effects. Nevertheless, long-term neuropsychological impairment is not easily detected among users. And furthermore, precise information about pattern of use, frequency, and amount of substance used are often not available. So many of the studies are not very clear concerning this information. So the objective of this study we have conducted, is to assess the effects of long-term use of ayahuasca in terms of three areas: psychiatric symptoms, pattern of drug use, and cognitive functioning. I'm not presenting all the information of the results since, as I mentioned, they have already been published in Journal of Psychoactive Drugs. But I'll get only some central information so that we can discuss these methodological points. The sample, two groups of 40 adolescents, aged between 15 and 19, both sexes, almost half and half males and females, were considered, being that 40 adolescents from the Brazilian Syncretic Church, UDV, who had drank ayahuasca within the ritual context at least 24 times during the last years. And 40 adolescents matched by sex and age who never used ayahuasca, so that we have this comparison group. What have we assessed in terms of psychiatric assessment? We use some standardized instruments. The self-report questionnaire, the 20-question questionnaire. If you answer positively to at least 7 questions, you are probably a mental case. Not necessarily, but it is said that the CSD, Center of Epidemiological Studies, Depression Scale, the Beck Anxiety Inventory, another, the State Trait Anxiety Inventory. We also use the Body Shape Questionnaire. Body Shape Questionnaire, for those who are not acquainted with this, it's a questionnaire that assesses the self-image someone has towards its own physical, own body, it's often impaired among anoretic patients, bulimic patients, and we have studied some other conditions. It's much more common in the whole population than we initially expected. And and finally, the CONUS adolescence rating scales that would detect attentional deficit and impulsiveness. So these were the domains in terms of psychiatric assessment. In terms of the neuropsychological assessment, we used a battery of 9 tests. The UCLA auditorial verbal learning tests, as the name says, is a learning test. The Ray figure copy, it is a memory test. We have to copy a figure after some. You see the figure. After that, you have to copy to redraw the figure. And it's a memory test, but that involves many complex cognitive functions. The trails, when you have the numbers and letters in sequence, the layer trail of the same Ray scales, digit span and digit symbol coding from the Wechsler scales for intelligence, the Stroop test that measures working memory, frontal lobe activity. We got back to the auditory verbal learning test, the layered trial, the same. And finally, the CPT, the continuous performance test that assess attentional problems and also impulsiveness. And we also assessed patterns of substance use in general. Both groups of adolescents were assessed in terms of psychoactive drugs use through the following instruments: the drug use screening inventory, and an instrument that gives us the pattern of substance use according to World Health Organization criteria. Well, the results. We have the 2 samples, UDV, the ayahuasca users, and the control group of adolescents. Half and half, because they were paired, and the same number of males and females. Age was quite similar. They were teenagers. Race similar, most of them Caucasian. Due to age, most of them were single. Social class, we have some difference here because it was not matched by social class. The UDV, ayahuasca users, almost most of them were A class or B class, but in the UDV group there was also some members of C and D class, less favorized people. Well, in terms of the results, the psychiatric assessment, general mental health, depression, anxiety, dysmorphy, the self-perception of the body, no difference at all between the 2 groups. Attentional deficit, we found some difference. Controls were more prone to have attentional deficits than ayahuasca users, but this not reached the statistical significance. The previous one was for male adolescents. We only identified this trend. The next one. As for female assessment, psychiatry assessment, we also didn't find any difference in terms of general mental health, depression, anxiety, and we cannot see here, but attentional deficit. But among females, we have this difference in terms of dysmorphic disorder. Among the control group, 55% had some kind of impaired self-perception of their bodies, what we couldn't find among the ayahuasca users, girls. In terms of recent substance use, there were some minor differences. Statistical significance was reached in terms of alcohol, where among UDV users, 1/3 used alcohol in the previous 30 days. It's not working. There is another one. Oh, this is better. While among the control group, 2/3 of the adolescents has some kind of recent alcohol use. In terms of amphetamines, there is a trend not reaching statistical significance. And although the use of other drugs among the control group was higher than among adolescents, from the ayahuasca group, this difference did not reach statistical significance. Next. If we stratify the same data about recent drug use by sex, we can see some specific difference. This difference of male consumption was particularly important among men in terms of alcohol recent use. Among cannabis recent use, there was a trend among men, male adolescents, of the control group to use more. And in terms of amphetamines, the girls of the control group there were more prone to use amphetamines. The neuropsychological assessment. We have, as I showed you, we have used a battery of many tasks that assess the many functions, neurocognitive functions, but we got the ones that had some kind of differences among the group. We have here, comparing the ayahuasca group with the control group, we have a trend in terms of the Stroop test. Stroop test is measuring basically working memory, frontal lobe functions, and we saw that here the control group has a better performance than the ayahuasca group, although this was not statistically significant. The Ray figure, which is a complex task involving many cognitive domains, we have the ayahuasca group was poorer than the control group, because this is time. So they spend more time in solving the problems than the control group, and this reaches statistical significance. But we can say, this is, I will comment just, it's one of the points of the methodological questioning of this kind of work. At this very time, in Brazil, we were discussing the problem of legalization or authorization of the official use of ayahuasca in the religious context. There was an intense debate at the time. And UDV members were very worried that the results of the discussion could eventually result in some kind of prohibition or restriction in the ayahuasca use. And these adolescents were aware of this problem. And one possible explanation for this higher time in performing could be the excess of care. They were spending more times in doing a very good test so that they could prove that they were not impaired and to have a good result. This could be a confounding variable in this kind of study. Another test that we used is the World Health Organization, together with University of California. Auditory verbal learning test is a learning test assessing basically memory, but as well as other important cognitive measures. So it was what we call a robust task. You have to remember a list of words that can be divided in some categories, different categories, and you have to recall in many subsequent attempts. And the number of words you remember are coded, and there are some populational patterns, and we compared the two groups. And in this test, also the control group performed better than the ayahuasca group. This test cannot be altered by this kind of problem that I mentioned in the previous test, because it's very rapid. The person has no time to choose or to decide what to do. It has to repeat just the words he has stored and is now recalling. And we saw that there were some minor difference among the group. But in the attempts, the last attempt, the attempt 7, they were equal. Such a minor difference, not statistically significant, showing that this difference is not noticeable. No. But here there is some data that, for our point of view, may raise new questions, and that may that should be addressed in future research. When we shared, we split the group in according to social class. This is the control part, not adolescents not using ayahuasca. If you see the performance of adolescents of the control group from class A compared to class B, you can see that the socio-economic status is a very important issue in terms of cognitive performance. But in the control group, it was quite similar, because we cannot see any statistical difference. So apparently, social class did not differentiate, was not different when we compared control adolescents. But if we examine what happened in terms of social class between the adolescents that used ayahuasca, we can see that we can reach some statistical significance in terms of the Ray figure, delayed recall test, and the attention verbal learning test. So people from less not so highly educated, we could call this, it would be a better definition in terms of cognitive performance. They do not perform as well as though that has had more opportunities in terms of educational background, is the class A subjects. So that's something to be addressed in future research. There is something that didn't happen in the control group, but does happen in the ayahuasca group. Is the influence of this socio-economic factors when ayahuasca is involved. So some comments in terms of psychiatric status. Comparatively to controls, we have lower frequencies of positive scoring for body dysmorphism, and attentional problems were detected among ayahuasca-using adolescents. However, these frequencies of attentional problems and body dysmorphic symptoms in the control group were much higher than those observed in the general population. That's to say, although there was a difference favoring ayahuasca users, it was so enormous, the proportion of these conditions among the control group, that we can argue if they are really representative of the general population. Próximo. Yes. This is our main questioning. Can the sample of adolescents, in the case of controls, be considered really representative? Pode pôr o próximo. In terms of pattern of substance use, ayahuasca adolescents tend to use drugs less frequently than the comparison group. Difference reached statistical significance for the use of alcohol. But we can argue, we can ask, we can reflect. The observed difference in terms of alcohol use among groups could just be reflecting, could not be, just be the reflect of impositive restriction of alcohol use with religious dogmatic principles. Because we know that since someone is in the religion, in UDV, they are told to avoid alcohol use, so that could be a secondary effect due to this dogmatic principle associated with the religion itself. In terms of neuropsychological aspects, adolescents who consume ayahuasca did not perform as well as the control group, whatever extra cognitive strength was required. This extra cognitive strength, I mean the most robust neurocognitive tasks that demand many functions, cerebral functions at the same time. Therefore, is it possible that ayahuasca may have some subtle effect on the cognition that can only be observed before highly demanding tasks? And more significant differences were found between groups when social class were considered. Among higher class adolescents, no significant difference were detected between subjects and controls. Whereas among lower social class adolescents, ayahuasca consuming adolescents tend to perform worse than controls on 3 domains: processing speed task, delayed visual memory measure, and verbal learning task. So, findings suggest that ayahuasca might have the subtle effect on different aspects of cognition, only detectable under less privileged conditions. Less educated people might be more susceptible to these effects. However, it is difficult to state whether this phenomenon might be due to a deleterious effect of ayahuasca on cognition or a mere reflection of poor educational opportunities due to unfair socio-economic conditions, or eventually both. We don't know. Next. Final comments. Ayahuasca adolescents use drugs less frequently than adolescents who do not use ayahuasca. Next. Adolescents who did not use ayahuasca presented more psychiatric symptoms than non-ayahuasca users. And finally, adolescents who consume ayahuasca performed well on all the neuropsychological tests. Why I'm after showing those differences favoring control groups, I have this final comment. Because we must remember that although there were statistically significant difference among the groups in terms of cognitive performance, the ayahuasca group they were all in the range of normality. So we are not saying that there was an enormous impairment. They just were their cognitive abilities were less sharp than the control group, but although they were all in the normal range of cognitive performance established in the literature. So that's why I have this final comments in this concerning their neuropsychological status. Acho que acabou. Well, these are a resume in short terms what we have done, what we are thinking about these results. And we are open to suggestions so that we can have more ideas for our future research in this field.
Thank you, Dartiu, very much. So, as announced before, the idea is that the two co-authors that are also present in the study could be offered a chance to give their feedback. I don't know if Evelyn wants to make any comments.
Okay, I'm Evelyn During Xavier da Silveira, and I was this neuropsychologist who investigated the adolescents in the study. It was a very nice opportunity to go through this investigation, and mainly because the opportunity we created to investigate was especially nice. We had these teenagers, all gathered, controls and the ayahuasca teenagers, let's say so, in a hotel for 3 days, and we kind of monitored all conditions we could, especially drug use, someone who might perhaps, have taken something from home, to use, or even cigarettes and alcohol and everything. So we were very careful, and we trust these results very much. What happened is, that just by chance, we intended when composing the samples, we intended to have the same groups exactly. So this difference in let's say in socioeconomic status was just by chance. It happened by chance, and it gave us after analyzing the results, it really brought us these doubts. Because we know, I don't know if it happens in other cultures, but in Brazil, education is a problem. Either you are very good, if you go to private schools and you have opportunities, you are really fantastic, in terms of cognitive performance. And if you do not have the chance to attend these schools, you might not have the opportunity. You might be very smart, but these tests, at least the way the methodology we used, these tests require people who are very much used to using these cognitive functions. So I think our study, if we had the chance, should go and go deeper into studying people with lesser opportunities, and of course probably we'd have to come up with different instruments to analyze. We in neuropsychology we have what we call what's the name? Forgot the name now. No, not a Q. Ecological. The ecological neuropsychological tests, which are tests made of which analyze your cognitive function by asking you to perform any task that involves your life. So according to the style of life you lead. So let's suppose we decided to investigate illiterate people. We'd have to come up with tests which didn't require people to read, or so, and then we'd have a comparison. So this is important. For example, ayahuasca is very much used in Brazil, and we have this problem. It'd be nice to know, right? So if there is any difference, because all drugs teenagers use, we know, although they don't show exactly many times in these formal neuropsychological tests, they do have a very subtle effect which we cannot presume. But when age comes, and this will be added, right, to your life, and in terms of getting better or getting worse, or perhaps not being able to develop, your better side in terms of cognitive function. So, all in all, this was a tremendous, opportunity to study these people. But we wish we, perhaps we have the chance to go on and now that we know more about this, see what how ayahuasca works in adults and in different groups of people, and especially the socioeconomic status, being an issue to be studied and controlled very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank and just make one remark and one question before I pass on to Charlie. The remark I want to make is that both Dartil and Evelyn came from Brazil on their own expenses. So they are spending a couple of thousands of dollars to be here now. I want an applause for that. My question is to you before we hand into Charlie, is that I saw there was something in your abstract that I didn't see in the presentation, that you mentioned in the abstract that you thought that perhaps the UDV members had kind of played an influence on which subjects would be picked to participate. And I was under the influence that the impression had suggested that perhaps in choosing the sample there was some kind of bias because they kind of excluded problematic subjects, so that would really compromise the representativity. But you didn't address that. Is it something you wish to address?
Yes, I can. There are two problems related to this question. When I meant representativity of the sample, it was quite by chance. It was randomized. There is no way to alter the original constitution of the two samples. But when I see the results that there is an enormous amount in control group of people with dysmorphic disorder among girls, of attentional problems among boys, that are much higher than the general population, I consider this is not a representative sample of the general population. This is by chance. It's not something that has been done wrong. That's not the problem. It's something can happen in any study. Another fact that I mentioned to you off the record, because this has not been published, it's something that we had in the second step study we have done, Charles Grob and me. It was interviewing some adolescents. We have never published this data. And since this was a very particular moment in the UDV, because there were the problem of the eventual restriction of ayahuasca use in Brazil, and that we saw many of the families very worried about what Charles Grob and me we were doing in terms of reporting problems, and we have eventually had to deal with situations where there was someone in the family with a mental health problem, and the family was worried that we could eventually attribute this mental condition to the use of ayahuasca. So this is a kind of sampling manipulation, but we can understand from the point of view of what was happening in terms of ayahuasca law in Brazil. I don't know if I answered your question.
Perhaps can you just explain how was the process of picking the 40 adolescents? How did that happen? What was the criteria?
In this case of the qualitative part of the research, this was much more. This was not by ballot or randomly selected. We just went to these adolescents, and they were referred. There was someone else. It was not. We were not worried in terms of representativeness. So it was more qualitative research. We were not worried about this kind of representativeness. So we asked to people to send us adolescents using ayahuasca. It was not important of if they were mental cases somehow or not. This was not the major issue. It was not important the sampling randomly selected sample. It was not the major issue. Perhaps Charlie can add something.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Excellent presentation. It's good to see our old data. It's been a long time since we've been together, and with Evelyn as well. So it's really nice to see our work discussed here. In terms of selection, my recollection, there was no effort to necessarily screen out anyone. You know, this was the second study with the UDV I was involved with. The first one in the early 90s with adults. The screening there was in a temple in Manaus. A call went out for volunteers for the study, and the criteria was simply you had to be a member of the UDV for at least 10 years. 60 people volunteered. There was room for, and we were recruiting for 15 subjects, so as was explained to me, they simply alphabetized the list and took every fourth person on the list, and they were included in the study. The study with the adolescents called for significantly more subjects. So I think there the call simply went out for volunteer adolescents. We should keep in mind that this is a preliminary study. I think we have some very interesting information, but our hope was, and still is, that it would just be the first step in what will be a series of studies to examine the cognitive function and mental health of adolescents who are exposed to ayahuasca. This is a very important issue within the UDV. At the time of the study, and the impetus for doing the study was that the Brazilian judiciary had questioned whether a sanction for use of ayahuasca within religious context in the late 80s, whether it should be restricted for adults only. And the UDV felt very strongly that this was of great value for their for the young people, so they felt an objective study, bringing in outsiders. Neither Dartu nor myself are members of the UDV, that this would help kind of clarify this this problem. I will say that within the UDV, it's very interesting how children are get involved. Women often take ayahuasca in utero, but while the children are in utero, throughout pregnancy and labor and delivery, it's somewhat different than the more indigenous model that was presented earlier this morning. Babies are baptized at ceremonies using an eyedropper, a couple of drops of ayahuasca, and then the general trend is that children do not participate until they reach puberty, and then they have the option. It's their choice. They have an option of joining their parents in at special UDV ceremonies that are more family oriented. The UDV does express at least their belief that the periodic use of ayahuasca actually improves cognition. That's their sense. In the adult study, we actually found some trends to back that the UDV members scored somewhat better on neuropsychological testing, although there it was not an ideal sample population, because while UDV members were entirely abstinent from alcohol and other drugs. A few of the controls for the adult study did regularly use alcohol, and perhaps that had an influence. So, one thing we could learn from these preliminary studies is the need perhaps for stronger efforts for better control populations. The kids on the control group for this study, I believe, they as you could see, they were from a higher socioeconomic level. They were from what I was told was a very good private school that parents had to pay for them to enter. So these were kids from well-off families with good educations. So there was certainly no effort to find controls who had a lower level of function. There's some preliminary indication here as well that perhaps ayahuasca and the support of the community might help kids resist the temptation or influence to experiment with drugs, as is often the case. One of our Brazilian collaborators from within the UDV, Glaucus de Souza Brito, who's organized much of this, was on a BBC documentary in '97, also called Psychedelic Science. And there he was quoted as saying, in his opinion, ayahuasca served as a vaccine for young people to resist drug abuse. And interesting concept, but certainly in need of more rigorous examination. Another interesting phenomena was the greater degree of attentional problems with the control population. Be very interested to test that. That also reflects a question that was asked earlier about young people and ADD. And finally, certainly in regards to the lower degree of drug use and abuse among the UDV members, perhaps ayahuasca is having a role, or perhaps it's the supportive structure of the religion, the structure of the religion, the supportive community that has an impact. I remember back in the early '90s when we were conducting the adult study, myself and Dennis McKenna and J.C. Calloway were invited to attend a ceremony, which we did. After the ceremony, I looked around and I could see multi-generational families, gathering together, and it was a very harmonious setting. Just very good cheer and people comparing what seemed to be consistently positive experiences. And so I'm looking at this harmonious setting, multi-generation families, and I pointed this out to Dennis, who replied, "That's right, Charlie. This is just like the Mormon Church, only on psychedelics." So that may be significant. My colleague, my late colleague, Marlene de Rios, sadly passed away a few months ago. She and I wrote extensively on the degree to which hallucinogens often have hypersuggestible effects. So, there's a downside to that if you're getting negative messages, but the upside could be if you're at a religious ceremony, and the UDV often provides what they call moral instruction, or just, how do you conduct yourself in day-to-day life. If they hear messages about the value of behaving responsibly in society, of respecting parents, treating your children well, functioning responsibly at work, and you're in a hypersuggestible state, that may have a lasting impact of a very positive nature. So I think the work we did with the adults and then later with the adolescents is very important, but again, keeping in mind these were preliminary investigations, and we can be instructed from them how to construct, I think, better protocols in the future, and I do hope we have that opportunity at some point, or other groups will have that opportunity to continue what I believe is very important work. So thank you, Bia.
Yeah, before we opened up to questions, I just realized that I think this would be a very important moment that we take 1 minute of silence in the memory of Marlene de Rios, who was a very pioneering person and did studies in the beginning of the 70s, and I think it was a great loss for the ayahuasca community. So I just want to ask 1 minute of silence in her memory. Thank you, everybody, for that. And we're going to have a round of questions. It's 12:09. We're going to go until 12:30. Then we're going to go for a lunch break. So if you want to come up and make your questions, we're going to take a few round of questions.
Let me try to answer some of the questions. The first one about the legal status of ayahuasca. Well, we had a board and the government of Brazil that decided, after the discussion about a lot of members of UDV, Santo Daime, many churches that use ayahuasca, together with some experts. And it has been decided that it was approved, the use of ayahuasca in Brazil within a religious context. If it is used outside religious context for recreational use, for instance, it is not allowed. But people don't pay much attention on it in general.
I would like to ask you to tell them that you were part of this member groups of discussion, that you were inside the government for discussions. Why don't you tell a little bit of your experience doing that?
Yes, that's a long story, but I was the person that was called by the Brazilian government to coordinate this group that would decide if ayahuasca should or not be used in Brazil. And it was very difficult to match the ideas and the interests of religious people, of scientists, of anthropologists and researchers. It was very, very difficult task we had. But finally we have a document that was the rationale for authorizing the religious use of ayahuasca in Brazil. And also in this document we stress the importance of authorizing also research on ayahuasca, so that we could go deeper in knowing what the more aspects of the ayahuasca use, not just the religious. There is a part of investigation also that was focused by this document. Concerning the use of alcohol, I don't know here in America, but in Brazil there is a tendency, a trend in the ayahuasca-using churches they recommend that the people should not use alcohol. It's not specifically a prohibition, but is a recommendation, a strong recommendation. And we know that most people try to avoid the alcohol use. Interestingly, we have noticed that many use cannabis, even someone use cocaine, but alcohol is a major concern for the churches. Concerning the question of exposure to ayahuasca, when we selected these adolescents, the requirement, the inclusion criteria was that they should have used ayahuasca at least 24 times in the previous 2 years, so that we could have some kind of religious integration within these ayahuasca churches. We have collected all the characteristics of this, the frequency of use, how long they were using. Some of them were using since they were in their mother's bellies. Other were recent users. But this was the inclusion criteria. We tried to do some research trying to identify if the longer they used could affect any of these things we have assessed, and we couldn't find anything specific in the sample. But it's a most sample, As Charlie mentioned, is a preliminary study. We have much more study to be done, but we don't have much more information about this. In terms of categories of social class, we know in Brazil it's a very important issue. In Brazil we have enormous difference in social status, economic status of the population. We have very, very poor people together with very, very rich people. And in most studies we try to address this issue of social economic condition. We used an index that is more acceptable in Brazil, that matches many information, the year income, where do you live, educational background, and so you get a lot of information that result in an index, and then you classify it in social class A, B, C, and D. You know. I can show you if you want more information about this kind of classification. I can send you. In terms of amphetamine use and prescribed Ritalin for these kids, in this description of amphetamine use, we only considered non-medical use. So it's the recreational use of amphetamine, not considering, for instance, Ritalin prescription. In this case, we have this kind of information too, and no one were under prescribed amphetamine in the sample. This is not a confounder in the case. And the last question is a good suggestion to see what happened with this adolescence. I was talking to Evelyn another day, and she had the same idea. We have almost 10 years of this research. These adolescents are now adults. And we thought it would be very interesting to know what happened to them 10 years after. At the time, they appeared to be very bright, very intelligent, very interesting people. And it would be a nice idea to know what has happened. Huh?
I just want to use this extra minutes and opportunity to ask if there is anybody in the audience who has particular experience in having taken ayahuasca while pregnant, or is the parent of children that take ayahuasca. If you would like to share some information on this topic of ayahuasca for infants and for pregnant women, does anybody have a contribution to give? Just found something new too. Apparently there's a guy named Stevens from Brazil that also knows doing some research about this topic. Maybe you can talk about after Toffoli.
Very briefly, my wife took ayahuasca while she was pregnant of our second child. What I can tell you is that apparently pregnancy has its own psychoactive effects by itself. So, so she took she perceived that she really had to take a very small amount of ayahuasca to feel a very strong experience. So, and this is the regular procedure within UDV to lower the doses for pregnant women, more or less half of the doses the person was used to. I don't know how it goes for the daime. I don't know how it is in the other traditions, but that our child is perfect, no problem. And of course, and in these cases, children start to take ayahuasca when they're older, so she never really have any opportunity to take. And normally, child take very small amounts anyway. So this is very important. People have to know that there's not like giving ayahuasca to children to have very strong experience. That's not like that. So I wanted to point this. People have sense. I want to make you know this. We're not very clear about the risks, of course, but people have sense. They're not stupid.
Thank you, Bia. So I am from Brazil. I am from Rio de Janeiro, and I am a stem cell biologist. So I work with neurodevelopment. So I use the stem cells to try to understand how the brain is formed. And last year I started to test the effects of ayahuasca during brain development using stem cells as some kind of model to study it. So Vanya Daksh, who's in the back there, she's the PhD student. And her thesis is try to understand how ayahuasca affects some aspects of development, including, for example, proliferation of neurons, cell death, expression of different factors. And so far, we haven't seen any difference in terms of cell death, which means that like ayahuasca does not kill neurons during development. So this is the one of the data that we have. We haven't seen any change in the levels of proliferation, but we have to increase the time to see it better, because one idea is that this proliferation can be named as neurogenesis, and neurogenesis is also associated with depression. I mean, when neurogenesis is a good evidence that the depression is low. So, but we haven't seen any difference, but we have to increase the sample. But the only thing that I can tell you is that cell death is not an issue when you think about ayahuasca for neurons during development, at least. Oh yeah, but Vanya has the poster here, but if anyone would like to talk to Vanya, we have the poster, and have a very interesting images too that nobody had done before, in which we are able to make a movie of live neurons when they have access to ayahuasca. So you can see, for example, the level of calcium influx into each one of the neurons. So they become blue, that's the color that we use to label the cells, and then when they have the ayahuasca, they change to green, that's based on the influx of calcium. So they're just trying to describe the signaling pathway that's involved in when the ayahuasca is in contact with human neurons. The test, okay. Oh, the kind of research that we do, we get skin samples for each person, and then we can transform that skin cells into neurons. That gave the Nobel Prize to Shinya Manaka last year, that kind of technique. So we are applying this technique to develop these neurons that could be from anyone of here without having to get the brain of anyone. Just have the skin, a very small sample. We transform it in human neurons that they have the same background as you. For example, if you get the skin of you, the same genome of the cells that are going to be the neurons are very similar to the brain, to the cells on your brain. So the idea is that to try to understand the biochemistry and the genetic behind behind the cells being challenged with ayahuasca. So this is the kind of model that we have, and we also have a new kind of setup of machines and robots where we can do like 384 samples per hour. So we can test different conditions, different concentrations of ayahuasca and other psychedelic substances in a very fast way. We're just starting.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just want to add my personal perspective on this article that I published in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs. I interviewed some medical professionals, some pharmacological, and basically what I showed is that it's what I call the logic of the half glass empty or the half glass full. So basically some doctors will say, well, there's not enough data, and with that they want to imply it's risky, we shouldn't do it. And some other doctors say there's not enough data, therefore we cannot say people can't do it. So I think this is a kind of fundamental dichotomy that exists that has to do with this concept of risk that is central in drug debate, which Toffoli addressed in his talk, which is how do we deal with potential risks, considering that I guess almost all pleasant activities in life involve risks, such as sex, eating, traveling, sports, or whatever. So what is the best way to deal with risks, to have like very protected sexual life is to have no sex, because then you don't get any rape or undesired pregnancy or some sexually traumatic, sexually transmitted disease, or maybe some sexual trauma experience too, just by having sex. So not having sex is the most safe way of not having any sexual related problems, but is this desirable? So I think we have to make the same question about drug use. Having zero risk is actually very desirable, but is this the best policy that we can come up with? And my general argument on the matter was, considering there is not enough data, and considering that this is part of a religious, central part of certain religious practices, that imagine if you are a father and you belong to a religion that you cannot take your children to. That is very complicated. It's like asking a parent that is Catholic not to take his children to catechism or to mass. It's considered central in both DIME and UDV to raise your children under these religious principles. It's considered important to transmit the doctrine and the teachings, and ayahuasca is some sort of considered a privileged means, not only to children but to adults. So it's part of their rights. Therefore, it's with the burden resides in the government to prove there is some very problematic aspect. So the burden is not on the groups to have to self-prove that what they do is okay. The burden resides on the government. Nevertheless, I want to point out that we cannot take for granted these issues, and there's also a kind of interesting anthropological contradiction that I didn't mention on purpose on my article. We anthropologists are more comfortable in assuming that we construct our texts according to our perspectives and not just to objective data. So I did not mention that in a lot of traditions, ayahuasca used by pregnant women is considered a high taboo, completely forbidden. And when Francisco Montes, it's too bad he's not here anymore, he mentioned he said in his little presentation that they say it's okay that you drink it until 4 months. So I think Toffoli mentioned this in his presentation, but he just said 4 months, not the whole pregnancy. So there's lots of variation. There's no cross, cultural study showing how different settings consider ayahuasca use to be interesting or not. And this is one of those things where biomedicine clashes with ethnographic data. For example, also regarding eating disorders, I have just recently, Brian, Celine, and I have done an interview with Taita Juan, and he mentioned that one of the good things, we asked him specifically, how does, is ayahuasca good for kids? Taita Juan is from the Putumayo, he's a Camseta, very traditional Yajecero group from Colombia. And he said that ayahuasca is considered especially good for children because it helps them learn. And then we're trying to see, should they do it before going to a test or when they are in high school or university. And one of the things he mentioned that it was good for learning. And the other thing he said that it was good to give to children because children are kind of picky on what they want to eat. They don't want to eat a lot of things. So it helps open their appetite. So I think that was nice if you consider, this anorexia bulimic thing that came up here. There's lots of perspectives, and I think very little dialogue on anthropology and biomedicine, and we lose a lot by this lack of dialogues. And I feel this is a true forum of dialogue in this sense. And I'm really excited to see this live dialogue because it's very rare to get MD doctors and shamans and practitioners in a room and talk. And so I think it's really good, and I'm really happy that you came. And he's very discreet, as you can see, very modest. He didn't mention very much his central role in leading this group, but can you imagine putting all the DIME and UDV people together in all those branches, like there's a saying in Brazil that the worst enemies of the ayahuasqueros are the ayahuasqueros themselves. It's not like they say, I'd rather deal with the DEA than, or our DEA than the other group. So Dartiu, in his discrete style, led this group, this communication, also with military representatives of the government and other sort of not so, progressive government representatives, together with anthropologists and all these religious people, and that was a very intense and creative process that led to a very pioneering legislation, which is actually a kind of ad hoc solution to negotiating drug conventions, international drug conventions, because Brazil found a way within the treaties to permit a certain kind of use, and it built its own parameters, its own set of rules based on a negotiation of civil society meeting both scientific interests and religious interests and government interests. So I think this model was successful. It can be criticized. There's limitations. There are paradoxes. For example, this idea that you can just have religious setting but not therapeutic setting, which was also came in our track. Jeffrey Brofman from the UDV pointed out how much the UDV is not comfortable with therapeutic uses of ayahuasca, and it's okay for religious use, but not therapeutic uses. So there's many things that could be said and many questions that could be raised, but it's definitely a pioneering legislation that has been exported and influenced regulations in diverse countries, including here in the US, because it's only because it's regulated in Brazil that it was authorized for the UDV and for Santo Daime in Oregon. Same thing for Spain, same thing for Holland. And behind those things, I'm not trying to make any mystification of Dartiu or my great colleague, Edward McRae, who is also another, kind of idol of mine that has done a lot of important role. But because of people like this, that we are having this legislation. So I want to close with that and call everybody to be back here in 1 hour at 1:30. Thank you very much.